The Princess on the Glass Hill. Beside the river there was a meadow, and in the meadow there was a barn, built to store hay. But for the past 2 years the barn had lain empty, for something mysterious was happening every Midsummer's Eve. Just when the grass stood greenest and deepest, the meadow was eaten down to the ground, so that next morning it all lay bare. It happened once, it happened twice, until the farmer said to his 3 sons, "One of you must go and sleep in the barn next Midsummer's Eve, and find out what's been eating my grass." The eldest son went first to watch the meadow. "You can trust me to look after your grass, father," he boasted. When Midsummer's Eve came, he set off to the barn and lay down to sleep. But in the night he heard a great clattering and a battering. The walls of the barn trembled, they creaked and groaned, and the earth itself shook. The eldest son jumped up and ran as fast as he could, not looking back until he reached home. And that year the grass was eaten up, every single last blade, just as it had been twice before. A year later, and the second son trudged off to the barn, boasting that he would save the grass. But as the night wore on, there was a rumbling and a trembling and a quaking, even worse than the year before, and the second son ran home as fast as he could. Next year came the turn of the third son. His brothers called him Boots, as they made him spend his time cleaning theirs, and they laughed at him for loving to sit by the fire with his feet among the cinders. "You'll never manage it," scoffed his brothers as he set off. "You're only good for toasting yourself by the fire and cleaning up after your elders and betters." Boots stumped up the hill to the barn, not caring about their taunts. Then he waited for night to come. The barn began to creak and groan, the ground rumbled and quaked, but Boots sat through it all, even though he thought the roof might come down on his head. Then, when all was still, he heard a noise, as if a horse were standing outside, cropping the grass. He crept to the door and peered through a hole between the planks. There stood a horse, feeding, but it was the biggest, fattest, grandest horse Boots had ever seen. It had a saddle and a bridle, and by its side, on the grass, lay battle dress for a knight, all made of gleaming brass. Boots lost no time. He was out of the door, pulling on the knight's clothes, then leaping up into the air, and onto the horse's back. And from the moment he sat there, legs astride its great girth, the horse became so tame he rode away on it to a secret place where no one would find it. "Well," said Boots, when he got home, "I lay in the barn until the sun rose, and I never saw or heard anything. I don't know why you two were so scared." "Ha!" said the brothers, "we'll soon see how well you watch the meadow." They set off, but when they reached the meadow, there stood the grass, as thick and deep as the night before. The next Midsummer's Eve was the same. Boots was the only one who dared to go back to the field. As he lay in the barn there was a clatter and a quake, followed by another clatter and a quake. Only this year the sound was even worse than the year before. Then, all at once, everything was still, and Boots stole to the door and peered through the hole, and there was another horse, chewing and champing at the grass. It was even finer and fatter than last year's horse, with a saddle on its back and a bridle on its neck, and a shining suit of silver fit for a knight by its side. Once again Boots flung on the suit and leapt onto the horse's back, while it stood still as a lamb. Then he rode the horse to his hiding place and settled it with the first one. After that he went home. "I suppose you're going to tell us you succeeded again?" asked his brother. "Go and see for yourself," boasted Boots. His brothers ran off to see, and there stood the grass, as thick and deep as the night before. When the third Midsummer's Eve came, the elder two still didn't have the courage to lie out in the barn and watch the grass. But Boots dared to go, and the same thing happened, except that the shaking and the quaking, the clattering and the battering were worse than ever. When it was over, Boots crept outside, quivering with shock. There stood a horse, far, far bigger and fatter than the two he had taken before. This one had a golden saddle and bridle that shimmered and shone, and a golden battle dress beside it. Boots pulled on the knight's clothes, leapt on the horse's back, and rode it to the hiding place. But when he got home, his brothers were too busy to mock him or to go and see the grass, just as thick and deep as twice before. Instead, their minds were full of the king's daughter, the princess. Her father has put her on a hill of glass next to the palace, with 3 golden apples in her lap. All across the land, everyone is saying that the man who can ride up and carry off the 3 golden apples will be given half the kingdom, and the princess as his wife. We're going to set out to the glass hill today to see who wins the princess." "I'll come too," cried Boots. "Oh, no, you won't," said his brothers. "Look at you, covered in dirt from cleaning our shoes and shifting the cinders, and your clothes are all crumpled and torn. People will make fun of us if we're seen with you." They set off without a backward glance, and when they came to the glass hill, they found knights and princes, all struggling up the slippery slope, riding their horses until they were all in a foam. But it was no good. The hill was too smooth and too steep, and each one rode and slipped and rode, until their horses were too weary to lift a leg. "We give up!" cried the knights and princes. Then, all at once, a knight came riding up on the largest steed anyone had ever seen. He wore a brass suit, and the horse had a brass bit in its mouth, so bright that sunbeams shone from it. "It's no good," the others called to him. "You'll never make it up that hill. All of us have tried, and all of us have failed." But the knight took no notice, and rode his horse up the hill as if it were covered in grass. When he was about a third of the way, he turned his horse round and rode down again. "Oh," thought the princess, "such a lovely night! If only he might come all the way up." And when she saw him turning back, she threw one of the golden apples from her lap, so that it rolled down to him. He picked up the apple, and then rode off so fast that no one could tell what had become of him. That evening Boots's brothers came home with a long story of the knight who had disappeared. He could have easily ridden the whole way up, they said, but he turned around and rode back down. "I wish I could have seen him," said Boots, sitting by the fireside. The next day the brothers set off again to watch the contest on the glass hill. "Oh, let me come with you," begged Boots. "You're too dirty," chanted his brothers. "You'll only embarrass us. Stay sitting in the ashes where you belong." When the brothers arrived at the glass hill, the same happened as the day before. The knights and princes rode and slipped and rode, but not one could get up the hill. And when they had worn out their horses, a knight came, riding on a steed even braver and finer than the last. The horse had a silver saddle and bridle, and the knight wore silver, all shining so brightly that the sunbeams danced over them. Once again everyone called out to him, "You can't do it!" But the knight paid no heed to them, and rode straight up the hill until he had gone 2/3 of the way, and then he wheeled his horse around and rode down again. The princess watched him and wished he would ride to the very top. So when she saw him turning back, she threw him the second apple. But as soon as he caught it, he rode off so fast that no one could follow him. The brothers went home again, and told Boots all that had happened. "Oh," said Boots, "I wish I could have seen him." The third day Boots once again begged to go with his brothers, but they wouldn't hear of it. When the brothers reached the glass hill this time, the knights had already given up, and everyone was waiting for the silver knight. But they neither saw nor heard him. Then, at last, a knight came thundering past in a suit of gold, with a golden saddle and bridle so bright that everyone had to shield their eyes. He rode straight to the hill, and tore up it all the way to the top, where he plucked the third golden apple straight from the princess's lap. Then he turned his horse and rode down again, charging away at full speed. "What a grand knight," said the brothers when they got home, "the grandest knight in the world." "Oh," said Boots, "I wish I could have seen him." "Ha!" laughed the brothers, "his battle dress shone brighter than the glowing coals you were always poking away at. You're not fit to touch the ground he walks on." The next day all the knights and princes were to pass before the princess, to see if any of them could bring forth the golden apples, but not one of them could produce them. "I want every man in the kingdom to come to the palace," declared the king. "Someone must have the golden apples." All the men came to the king's palace, one after the other, but no one had a golden apple. At last it was Boots's brothers' turn, and as they were the final two, the king asked if there was anyone left in the kingdom who hadn't come. "Oh yes," they said, "we have a brother, but he could never have carried off a golden apple. He just sits in a heap by the fire, with his feet stirring the cinders." "Never mind that," said the king, "he must come like all the rest." So the brothers went back and ordered Boots to go to the palace. "Well now," said the king, "have you got a golden apple? Speak out." "I have," Boots replied. "Here is the first, here is the second, and here is the third too," he said, pulling the apples from his pockets. Then he threw off his sooty rags and stood before them in his gleaming golden suit. "There you are," said the king. "You shall have my daughter and half the kingdom, for you deserve both." Boots's brothers could only gape and stare. Boots and the princess were married, and there was great merrymaking at the bridal feast. All I can say is, if they haven't ceased their merrymaking, they're celebrating still.